Hi folks, it's Thibaut Van Dam here with another YouTube video. And for those of you who are not familiar with my channel, I am a DIY singer-songwriter and guitar tutor based in Southeast London. And today I'm very excited to be continuing my video series all about practical guitar and music theory. I started the series a little while ago. It was just to consolidate everything I know about playing guitar for my current students and anyone else that is interested in learning how to play guitar. Today we are continuing our study of some theory, but this is important theory and this is something that can be applied in a practical way. And I will talk about that maybe in this video a little bit, but also in a later video. Specifically, we're looking at the concept called the major scale. And I'm saying the major scale because it is in fact the only major scale, not to be confused with the idea that there is a special E major scale and then a special C major scale, that actually all major scales have something in common. And that's sort of what we'll be talking about today. And of course, why do we want to know about the major scale? Well, the major scale is so important for understanding how to play riffs or melodies, but also eventually it's the way we start to understand how to play chord progressions and the way that notes actually relate and how they transfer over to the chords that we play in things called key signatures. So this is actually a huge deal, not only if you're interested in soloing or playing along with other people and collaborating, but also actually if you want to know how to write your own music, this is going to be critical information to getting that point. So if this sounds interesting to you, please consider liking the video. Please consider subscribing to the channel. It is the best way to stay up to date with the things I make. And of course, it continues to motivate me to make these videos. Thank you to everyone that does subscribe. I've got a few things to get through and I don't want to waste anyone's time, so let's get into it. To help me in this explanation today, I was reading through this book, again, Hal Leonard, Guitar Method Specific to Music Theory. This is a book I've recommended in my video all about resources. I'll maybe put a link in the corner for that video if you're interested. This is a phenomenal book, and I was reading through it just to kind of give me some ideas of sort of a starting point and different topics that I definitely had to talk about in this video. And I realized actually that the opening of this chapter is actually really to the point and it's super succinct. So I'll actually be doing something that I don't even know if I'm technically allowed to do, but I will be reading sections from this and supplementing those sections with sort of my own interpretation or my own kind of explanation of this section. And I have a feeling that this way I'll be sure not to miss any important stuff. And of course, throughout the video, I'll be adding my own sort of thoughts on the major scale. So a scale, just to begin with, is a succession of notes, a succession of notes, or sequence of notes, rather, I prefer to say, that are arranged in a specific order of intervals from its tonic, or root, rather central note, all the way to its octave. So if you are familiar with the last video we did all about intervals, those two terms, tonic or root and octave, are going to sound familiar. And just to recap, just briefly, the idea of an octave is that when you play a note, in this case the note E, when we go up a full chromatic scale, along the way there are spaces. Each of those spaces from that note E to any of the notes in the chromatic scale can be characterized by something like a major second or a minor second or a perfect fourth or perfect fifth or tritone even. And at a certain point we get to the octave. The octave is exactly one chromatic scale away from the initial starting point. And again, that initial starting point is the tonic or the root. And this idea of the root or tonic, these things are going to help us in constructing both scales and also chords. So it's important to get familiar with sort of that language, and I'll probably be using it from here on in. So to continue, it's a sequence of notes that are in a specific order of intervals, all the way from its root to its octave. The major scale is a diatonic scale, and the way that they've described diatonic is that they're saying that it contains 7 notes of the musical alphabet. And this goes back to this kind of rule or formality I brought up in a past video, where when we create scales, the only time we choose to use flat instead of sharp, or vice versa, is when we want to avoid duplicating any alphabetical notes. So if a scale, for instance, included the notes A and A sharp, to avoid saying A twice, and to be diatonic according to how they're saying it, we would want to call A sharp, in fact, B flat. We would say A, B flat, C, or whatever, right? And we would continue that sort of sequence of notes according to the alphabet. We wouldn't want to say A and A sharp. That's how they're saying it. I actually think diatonic also means something else, which is very important to distinguish. Diatonic the key distinguishing feature of it is that it's related to a scale in general. And that is a big distinguishing feature from something being chromatic. So if something's chromatic, if you can describe it in music, it's because you heard a series of notes that followed the chromatic scale, in fact. If you include all those notes, you're basically playing something that is chromatic. You're playing every note, and that's the way that I think about it. When you play something that is diatonic, you're not playing every note. You're playing a specific series or formula of notes spaced out by either whole steps or half steps, which leads me really neatly to the idea of what the formula is actually formulated of. So the formula to the major scale, and actually all scales, is a series of either whole steps, half steps, or sometimes on occasion 1.5 steps. And this idea of step, just to refresh your memory, is a half step rather, is the equivalent space of 1 fret. And a whole step is the space of 2 frets. So it's kind of like half plus half equals 1 whole. And so it's a little bit weird to think about it like that, but each fret equals a half step. These terms can sometimes be called less commonly whole tone or half tone. I stick to half step and whole step, and I like thinking about them like steps. This relates to another thing that they say in this book, which is that the notes of the scale are called scale degrees or scale steps. And very much so, like steps, they are steps that lead and build up to something, and that something is usually the octave. And so we follow this formula. It is either a series usually of, like I said, whole steps or 2 frets, or half steps, which is 1 fret. And while we're here, and we're just right on the precipice of talking about what that formula is, I'll just do a quick deviation. I need to stress the idea here that the major scale is not exclusive, or it exists regardless of what note you start on. And that's not to say that the notes are not affected equally, but I want to reiterate this really important idea that I talked about in a past video called universality. Universality I've talked about in the video about intervals, but also in the video about chromatic scale. So the idea of universality here is that it has to do with that idea of equal temperament. Each note is of equal value to each other. It's to say basically that the note G is of not any more musical mathematical value than the note E or C or whichever note, or F sharp. And usually with accidentals, that's where sometimes people get confused about that. Accidentals like F sharp are equivalently valued to F or G or whichever of these notes. This is an important idea to really stress, because when this then translates to the idea of intervals, the idea of intervallic space is also universal. So a major second is equal from the space of E to F sharp, just like the space from F sharp to G sharp is also a major second. The major second is like saying you have a line that is 2 frets long. So to say 2 frets long, well, 2 frets can be from here to here, it can be from here to here. It could even be from the note that was previous to this and that. So that could be saying D sharp and E. That's also a major second. And this idea of the spaces being equal is also relevant. And that leads me very nicely to the idea that the scales, the formulas for the scales, which remember are combined or are constructed of either half steps or whole steps, that those formulas are also universal. So just to show you the universality, this is the E major scale. And for instance, the C major scale. Or the A major scale. So there's something sonically very similar between each of those. Just like there's something very sonically similar to all major chords. Those are all major chords, just like all minor chords have something in common. And you can frame that however you want. The characterization is minor, but you could think about it also like all minor chords are sad. That's another way of thinking about it. I try to avoid characterizing something or attributing emotional criteria to each of the intervals or each of the characteristics, because I sometimes like to use minor things to create things that sound happy, or major things to sound sad, or using things that are not really usually associated with those intervals or spaces. So this idea of the scale being transferable means that actually you don't have to learn a C major scale, you don't have to learn an E major scale, you have to learn the major scale, the one major scale. And now that I've done this divergence, let's talk about what that actual scale is. The scale follows a series of notes, either half steps or whole steps away. And for the sake of simplicity, I will choose the E major scale. So this is going to be the major scale because we're following the formula of the major scale. And the major scale includes a root, a whole step, a whole step, a half step, a whole step, a whole step, a whole step, and finally a half step. And in practice, this is what it looks like. We have E followed by a whole step, F sharp, followed by another whole step, G sharp, followed by a half step, A, followed by a whole step, B, another whole step, C sharp, another whole step, which is D sharp, and then another half step, which is E. Now, I've been playing for a while and thinking about theory quite a lot, so I'm able to remember kind of the locations at this point on the fretboard, but I can also just think about it kind of quickly. You know, a whole step up from C sharp means C sharp, D, D sharp. That's how I can think about it. And so, like I pointed out in past videos, knowing the chromatic scale, like the back of your hand, is absolutely crucial. Knowing the order of the notes, which notes have sharps or not. You know, for instance, E goes to F, or B going to C. Knowing that is actually really important to keep in mind. Now, you might have noticed that actually when we got to the note A, we could have actually used that practical string rule that I talked about in a past video, which is the 5-0 rule. This was a rule that we looked at in the video all about standard tuning and how to tune your guitar, where if you play the 5th fret on the low E string, it's the same as playing the open string just below it. So this is the note A, and this is also the note A. Let me just go ahead and, yeah, a little brighter, that's better. This is the note A, the 5th fret on the E string, and then the open A string is also the note A. So instead of playing the 5th fret here like we did, we can actually move these notes down, and actually instead of playing only on one string, we can actually play on many strings. So we have the first open note E, followed by up a whole step, F sharp, up another whole step, G sharp, followed by a half step, which is A, which we're going to do on the open A string. So all together. Then followed by the 2nd fret on the A string, which is B, followed by up a whole step, right, which is C sharp, followed by a whole step. Now, what's a little bit uncommon here is that instead of playing the open string, we actually have to go up that whole step. So we've just played the note C sharp. Like I pointed out a moment ago, a whole step away from C sharp is D sharp, right? That's the note. But the issue is that we can't use that 5-0 rule exactly the same way. If we play the 5-0 rule, if we minus 5 from the note, well, this note here, D sharp, we actually end up with the 1st fret on the D string. See, instead of playing it just open like the note D. See, that would be the note D. That doesn't really sound like the major scale, and that's why it sounded out of place. So we need to remember to play the 1st fret on the D string. That's the note D sharp, followed by finally a half step. And that brings us back from D sharp to E, half step up. So we have root, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Now I'm not going to say anything. And then in reverse. And that is our E major scale. Now, something else worth pointing out is that this scale, you know, follows this pattern. You could copy and paste that kind of pattern of whole, half, whole, whole, you know, the whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. That pattern, you can copy and paste that on any note, really. And it will work on every single one of these notes. And following this exact pattern, physically, the E-shaped major scale can be moved like this. That would be the F sharp major scale. Another thing worth pointing out is that this scale actually continues well beyond the octave, right? So even though they're talking about the scale and how it continues up to 1 octave, really, as long as the chromatic scale continues, so does the major scale, in a theoretical way, right? For instance, as we played through these notes, see, we could have kept going. I actually just made a mistake there. So this is an important idea to try to take on board. This idea that actually there's something really universal to the scale, but also something kind of indefinite. Just like how the chromatic scale just kind of continues, and after we have the note G sharp, we go back to the note A and A sharp and B, and eventually, you know, we end up back at G, G sharp, A again. The major scale can continue in that way. So at this point in the video, I feel like I've covered most of the important things that I wanted to discuss. I wanted to talk about the universality of the major scale, the fact that E major is not especially something unique about E that makes it major. You can simply just apply the major scale to the note E, that the major scale itself follows a series of whole steps and half steps that you can follow that will result in that formula that we hear, that we have come to understand as being the major scale. And so on, you know, all of these are following that same pattern of root, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. So I think that the final thing I just need to point out here is that while this might seem like we have to commit so much to our memory, we have to remember so much, that actually, if you have memorized the chromatic scale, if you have memorized the idea of intervals, although you don't necessarily need to for this, and you've memorized now the major scale, if these are ideas that you have on board, I just want to read this top line in chapter 3, page 16, which is, the major scale is the fundamental scale in Western music. In melodic terms, all traditional music theory is based on the major scale. This is such a crucial idea to take on board, and it's the kind of thing that I'll only really be able to demonstrate to you when we go through the next kind of scales. When we look at, say, the minor scale, or when we look at modes, or when we look at how other scales start to get formed, we actually start to realize that those scales are related to the major scale. That the major scale is actually our point of reference. And you might be scratching your head thinking, like, what does that actually even mean? But if we just bear in mind the idea that we're usually thinking major, and that any anomalies to major are usually, like, for instance, minor is actually a type of major scale. I know that sounds weird. I'll explain it later, but it's food for thought. So my best advice really at this point is to try to implement this scale, this formula we now know. You can do this by writing up the notes, the chromatic scale through and through. You can do it according to, say, the strings of the guitar. So you can start E, A, D, G, B, E, and you can write the chromatic scale from E to E or beyond if you want, and you can write up the major scale. Now, actually, weirdly, each of the strings on the guitar follow that same physical pattern going up the one string. So that root, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. So in a sense, if you actually were to do a bar chord, you could actually also play the major scale of the entire standard tuning, although it might sound a bit funky. But to do that, and I think the bonus, of course, is to always think about the actual note you're playing. Because you can play the scale by following that physical pattern that I just showed you, and how I was able to move it. You can memorize that pattern and physically move it around and always play the major scale. But knowing the note you're actually playing, that will be also very valuable at a certain point, because it will help us in understanding how the notes themselves relate from one scale to another. So I think I've said plenty of stuff to think about here. I hope you found this video informative and helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out, write something in the comments below, or actually I put a link if you are interested in lessons, or if you're interested in just asking me just a question or two or something about what we talked about today. If you found this video informative and helpful, please consider liking the video. Please consider subscribing to the channel. It is the absolute best way to stay up to date with the things I do. And of course, it motivates me to keep making this content. And thank you to everyone that does subscribe. It really does mean a lot. I apologize that this video was a little bit later in the week. I was just busy this weekend, and this is a big topic, so I really had to prepare for it too. Thanks for watching. I'll see you at the next one. Ciao for now.